You ready for this? First of all, I grew up in Buffalo, New York, and I went off to a college as far away from my parents as I could possibly find one. And since the colleges in Kyoto, Japan, or Beijing were not yet open to Americans, that was Reed College in Portland, Oregon. A nice, comfortable 2,500 safe miles away from my family. And when I got there, I was put in a room with three roommates in a male dorm. And the guys in the dorm used to, and TJ, I told you, I was always the kid from Venus or Mars. And kids didn't want to have anything to do with me. I told you that when I was a little kid and I would show up near a baseball diamond where the teams were picking up sides, they would literally pick up their bat, ball, and gloves and try to find a location where I couldn't find them. So they wouldn't feel pressured into picking me for one of the teams. I was not popular, TJ, and it didn't get any better when I got to Reed College. Reed College had the highest median SATs of any school in the country that year, higher than Harvard, higher than MIT, higher than Caltech. You'd think that there would be some mercy among these super brainy people, but no, they were just as picky and snotty as anybody else on the face of the planet. Well, the guys would hang around together, the three guys, along with the four guys from the room across the hall, and they would sit there drinking wine, and they would swirl the wine between their fingers, and they would sniff the wine delicately to show how utterly sophisticated they were.
Oh, man.
And they would brag about the vintage of the wine and the particular nature of the grapes in that particular valley and the sun that came from the hills beyond and all of that kind of stuff. And they would do this for hours.
Allow me
but eventually,
crude comment here.
Yes?
They sound like a bunch of...
Only crude comments tonight.
Yes, they sound like a bunch of pretentious cocksuckers to me.
Of course! That's what they were, a bunch of pretentious cocksuckers. And guess what they would tell stories about for hour after hour after hour?
About all the pussy they got, I would imagine.
That's right, all their romantic conquests, sitting there swirling their glasses with God knows 7 other guys. And they were bragging about all the girls they had gotten. How many girls were they likely to get on a Saturday afternoon, sitting there swilling this rat gut, bragging to a bunch of other guys? So while they did that, I would go off to the woman's dorm. Because I preferred hanging around with women. Women are cute. Women are adorable. Women are cuddly. Women are fun. So, and the girls in the girls' dorm used to practice making hickeys on my neck. Now, TJ, remember, I never had a date. No girl ever held my hand, much less hickeys. I had no idea what these girls were doing to me. I didn't know where this strange business of hickeys comes from. But I would show up back at my dorm at 7 o'clock in the evening or 8 o'clock in the evening when the wine bottles were practically empty and these poor guys were sloshed. You know what they would be doing? They would be screaming at the top of their lungs like a bunch of howling wolves, "I'm so horny, I die!" And they do this for half an hour. And then in would come little Howie Bloom, you know, the guy from Venus, with hickeys all over his neck. Now, what do you think that did to my popularity?
I can see that going either way, actually.
Well, they loathed me. They despised me. They were the sophisticated ones. They were the ones who knew one vintage of Cabernet Sauvignon from another. They even knew how to pronounce Dom Perignon. And I didn't. What the heck was I doing showing up with hickeys on my neck while they were bragging about all the girls they had gotten? There was no God in this universe. Well, meanwhile, my 3 roommates sat around for 3 months, from approximately October until December, plotting something. And every time I showed up in the room, they'd stop their plotting because they didn't want me to hear a word of what they were plotting about. And the most sophisticated of my 3 roommates was, in those days, it was folk music. Folk music was big. Joan Baez was all over the place. Bob Dylan hadn't even shown up yet. He was another 2 years into the future. And being able to play a guitar, let's see if we can see this with her. Yes, I'm strumming a guitar. No, you can't see that at all. Ah! Okay, we have to get a wider panning camera. Okay, so a guy who could sit around plucking all kinds of folk tunes on a guitar and could actually remember all the words and sing them and actually hit the notes, that was a superstar on campus. And my most sophisticated roommate was capable of doing that with 220 songs minimum. He was good. He was really good. Well, one day, while my three roommates were busy plotting the thing they wouldn't tell me anything about, um, I went off to the cafeteria. And since groups tend to gather in cliques at the cafe tables, and I'm never a part of those cliques, I wasn't very comfortable sitting down with anybody else. But and I preferred to be with girls when possible, and I was in luck. There was one girl sitting all alone at one of these big tables designed for 12 people. So I went over and sat with her. Now, I had read Jack Kerouac and On the Road, and I wanted to drop out of high school and buy a motorcycle, and motorcycle from Buffalo, New York to California back in that was 1959 or something like that, long before the 60s started. And somehow my parents had gotten together with my teachers and all convinced me not to do it. But I wanted to go find Zen Buddhist Satori and all kinds of stuff like that. And I wanted to hitchhike, and I wanted to ride freight trains illegally, which in those days was called riding the rails and was a highly romantic thing that nobody I'd ever met had done. And I sit down next to this girl, and she's gorgeous. And she's bright. She's so bright. I mean, we're both into French literature like crazy. And she starts telling me the plots of Jean Ennui plays. And she makes every one of them so fascinating that you drop everything you're doing, you forget that you're eating, your jaw hangs open, and you just can't, you listen with absolute glee and delight. And it turns out she'd hitchhiked. And I had never hitchhiked in my life. A girl who had hitchhiked? This was astonishing. Well, we got so involved in our conversation about poetry and Jean Ennui and French literature that we somehow wandered out together after lunch and kept talking. And we forgot about our classes that afternoon and kept talking. And we were still talking at 11 o'clock that night. And at 11 o'clock that night, I discovered the following. There was a great big dorm building, an old Victorian building. And it was separated into 7 different dorms. 3 of those dorms were men's dorms, and 4 of those dorms were women's dorms. And they were absolutely separate, TJ. Separate walls, separate entrances, the whole thing. Because girls and guys were not allowed together after 11 o'clock at night in those days in dormitories. Well, I was afraid that the girl I was with was going to get locked out of her dorm. They locked the doors at 11 o'clock at night. Don't worry about it, she said. You know why? Because her dorm room was on the 3rd floor. Sounds a little daunting, right? The building was made of brick. Jimsy, the person that I was with, this woman, could climb any brick wall in sight. She didn't worry about having to go in through the entrance because she would simply climb the wall of the dormitory to her 3rd floor window and let herself in. I was stunned. But of course I knew I would never see this girl again. You know, I didn't have any luck. I couldn't even date and hold hands. How would I ever see this astonishing woman again? The next morning at 9 o'clock, a head poked through the entrance door downstairs, and it called up through the stairs to our 3rd floor room and said, "I think I left my notebook there." And it was Jimsy, this absolutely fabulous woman. So once again, we spent an entire day together and never got to a single class. And that's not like me. I show up at things. So we spent the whole day. It was a stormy day. We were out on the grass of the campus, and Jimsy showed me that even in the middle of a storm, she could climb any tree she wanted, and she could. She walked around barefoot in jeans, with a great big sort of greenish, God knows, army surplus shirt or something like that. But she had another side. There was a ball every year at Christmas time or New Year's, and everybody who dressed slowly as could be at this most bohemian of all campuses in the United States of America made a point of dressing in the most extraordinary formal outfit you could possibly imagine for the Christmas ball. Well, it turns out Jimsy, because she was a sophomore, I was only a freshman, she was an experienced woman, that Jimsy designed and made her own formal gowns for these things. Not only that, when she was 15 years old, she had gotten a crush on her high school headmaster. She'd gone to a private school, and she had decided to seduce him. He was married with a kid older than she was. Well, it took her 6 months, but she did it. And in fact, that guy was the great love of her life. Okay, Jimsy, at a certain point, started sneaking me up to her dorm room and keeping me there overnight. Not for sex, TJ. Look, I was ignorant as a brick. And so I would lay there, and Jimsy would have her head on my forearm. And since I was scared to death of doing anything wrong, I would leave my forearm there from midnight until 6 o'clock in the morning. Now, there's a small problem when somebody's head is on your arm in exactly the same position until 6 o'clock in the morning. Your hand goes to sleep. So does your forearm. You could lose it for lack of circulation, for God's sakes. But no way in hell was I going to move my arm if Jimsy Law's head was on my bicep. And then Jimsy showed me that she took me outside her room on the third floor. My room was on the third floor at the very opposite end of this 7-dormitory building. And she showed me that there was a hatch in the ceiling. She showed me how to lift the hatch. She showed me that up above the hatch there was a crawl space for people who had to fix the electricity or the heating or the pipes. And all it was a set of boards, a set of narrow planks sprawled across or laid across the beams of the ceilings. If you took a misstep on one of these things, you'd go crashing through the ceiling of some other girls on a third-floor room someplace. And she showed me how to crawl across the beams to get to my dormitory room, so I would be there by 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning when I needed to be. Well, I still could not figure out what my roommates were up to. And Jimsy asked me if I would live with her over the Christmas vacation. Live with her? I'd never held hands. I'd never had a date. I didn't know what necking was. I didn't know what petting was. I didn't know what feeling somebody up was, for God's sake. Most people, by the time they reach 19 years old, have had 7 years of practice at this stuff. 7 years of frustration trying to get their hands up girls' blouses. They've at least touched the nipples of 3 young girls in their lifetime. Or I would imagine, because I've never been normal. So that's what I would imagine happens with normal people. None of that had happened with me. Not a thing. And she wanted me to stay over the Christmas vacation with her. Now, my parents felt that they had undergone a great deprivation by doing without me for Thanksgiving vacation and not making me come to Buffalo. Why? Because they were really, really, really looking forward to Christmas. So when I called, for them it was Hanukkah. Oh, well, that's another matter. So one way or the other, when I called home and said I'm not coming, my mother and father nearly had heart attacks. And when they figured out it was because I was going to be living with a girl, which is absolutely unspeakable at the tail end of the 1950s, which is what 1960 was, the tail end of the 1950s, a highly repressive decade, a decade so repressive that if you became pregnant, everybody in your city knew about it, and you might as well have been carrying a scarlet A on your forehead and your chest, because everybody looked down on you. Everybody turned their back on you. Everybody let you know how they disapproved of you as the slattern, the whore, the absolute epitome of evil in their town, who would never once again ever be regarded with a minute of respect. Do we have an echo on the phone?
I don't hear it.
Okay, good. If there's a little bit of an echo. Okay, now, so when my parents heard that I was going to be living with a girl, they were horrified. They were shocked. I mean, you got to realize this is a bunch of parents who later came to me several years later. By then, it was the 60s. It was 1964, 1965 when they showed up to give me this message. They showed up in New York. They asked me to dinner. By that time, I was living with another woman, and they said, have dinner with us. And I said, fine, I'll come with the girl I'm living with. And they said, no, you will not come with the girl you're living with. If you're coming with the girl you're living with, we're not seeing you for dinner at all. Now, that's a harsh thing for my parents to say because they really wanted to see me. They wanted to see me very badly. But my dad sat me down and explained to me, son, there are 2 kinds of women. There are women you screw, and there are women you marry. And the 2 are radically different. That's how bad things were even in 1964. So imagine what they were like in the 50s. So when I said I was going to be living with a woman on the Christmas vacation, this meant I had just descended to a low point of slime, sleaze, and absolute sin that no amount of Yom Kippurs and fasting would ever get me out of. Worse than original sin, worse than an apple, and an extra bit of knowledge. The worst. Okay, so the details go as follows. I mean, there I was with Jimsy, and we were living together in this little place that stank of kerosene because it had kerosene lighting and a kerosene stove. I've never been in a place like it before, and I've never been in a place like it since. And one night, I don't remember how it happened, but one night Jimsy made it very apparent to me that she was interested in having sex. Well, this is shocking to me. And TJ, you were tempting. I mean, I'm going to have to go into the gory details here. This is going to be quadruple X-rated, at least quintuple X-rated,
Do it.
um, sextillion X-rated. Okay, so we had sex. I don't remember that much about it because I was so incredibly self-conscious. So there we were having sex, and I felt as if everybody in my high school, all the people who used to brag about having sex, all the girls, the girl who was considered the slattern in the school, the slut in the school who I liked. I used to like her a lot because we were both outcasts, and she was pretty. Um, and a few people willing to sit next to me on the school bus. But I had all these kids in an arena in my head, and they were watching every move I made. It was terrible. I had no privacy, none. And one of the consequences was that I never ejaculated, and I had an erection that lasted 3 hours. Well, I felt like a miserable failure. I had never ejaculated. But when school came back in session and Jimsy Law went back to talk to her girlfriends again for the first time in a long time, guess what? Told everybody on campus.
I have no idea.
This guy's amazing! Amazing! I was so self-conscious I couldn't I couldn't function properly. That's why I was amazing. For God's sake, I had absolutely crapped my way into such intense failure that my failure to come out on the other end is a success. Then one night I was busy making a horse roast because I loved a horse meat roast because to cook, and I love to cook especially when there are other people to eat what I'm cooking. And horse meat was the only thing we could afford, and it was for sale in Portland and Seattle in those days. So I was making a horse meat roast when a knock came to the door of our little kerosene cottage. And it was a girl outside the door who seemed to be crying and in great distress. So Jimsy said, let me put on my coat. I'll go out for 10 minutes. I'll be back. Now, I'm timing this horse meat roast. There's a certain moment when you take it out of the oven and it's perfect. And you have to eat it within 15 minutes or you've destroyed the entire effect of your lovely, wonderful horse meat roast. It should have been running around on a prairie somewhere eating grass, but that's another subject. Well, 10 minutes by and Jimsy didn't show up. 20 minutes went by and Jimsy didn't show up. 2 hours went by and Jimsy didn't show up. I know the horse roast was what the horse meat roast was. I hope our viewers enjoy these stumbles in the land of tricky verbiage. At any rate, so Jimsy didn't show up. Finally, I got desperate. I got on my bicycle and I went all over Portland hoping to find her. Well, you know, people are indoors when you're looking for them. They're not out on the street. Your chance of ever finding that shows true desperation, roaming around 10 miles on a bicycle in the middle of the night, thinking you'll find somebody. For God's sakes, nobody's around. And finally came back at midnight in absolute despair. I don't remember when Jimsy showed up. It was probably about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. And this is when I discovered what my roommates had been plotting for the last 3 months. The girl who had come to the door in a state of terrible distress, with tears streaming down her face, was a decoy. She was a shill. She was a phony. She got Jimsy all the way down the street to the corner, and there was a car with its motor running, and its rear door open waiting for her. And she was shoved into the car, and it was my roommate, the one who strummed the guitar and could sing 220 folk songs. Why? And plus another one of my roommates. Why? Because they had been plotting one thing and one thing only during the course of those 3 months, to get the most attractive, the most spectacular, the most amazing girl on campus to go with my roommate, the folk singer, to the annual Christmas ball. And I had totally... What do you think I'd done to their plans, DJ? By ending up living with the woman and sleeping with the woman, that this guy was simply trying to get to a dance in the hope that some of these other things might someday, if he was good and if he worked hard enough, follow. You know, I'd gone to go without passing whatever it's called. I'd gone directly to go. I'd gotten the $200. And he was still planning on how to get on whatever those slovenly little places in blue and purple are down at the bottom of the board. So when I got back to school, when the summer vacation or when the winter vacation, whatever it's called, Christmas vacation ended, I discovered that my roommates had gone to the dean. And they had said to the dean, this is not a person we are compatible with. Could you please throw out of our room? And guess who they were talking about? Me. So I was ejected from my room. But at that point, I was so intent on going after enlightenment and Satori that I was intent on breaking my bonds to all of the escape mechanisms that we use on this planet to keep ourselves from that sheer and unbidden little spontaneous flame deep down in our heart, like a pilot light, that Satori helps us approach. And so I wanted to break all of my bonds to things that were comforting to me. And one of them was my bonds to a room. So I never went to the other room where I was supposed to live. Instead, I started keeping a blanket on campus and sleeping at strange hours of the day and night and sleeping on empty floors. I would sleep on the floor of the basement of the library when they locked it at night. I would sleep in the empty social rooms of dormitories far, far away at 3 o'clock in the morning when nobody was occupying them. And that's when I began to go through my deliberate dissociation of the senses, as Rimbaud called it, on my quest for Zen Buddhist enlightenment. But that's another story for another time. That doesn't necessarily have all that much to do with sex, but you never know. Since everything we do, including being abstinent from sex, is in one way or another a display gesture that has something to do with sex.
Okay.
Well, can I toss just one
okay.
other little note?
Sure.
Speaking of assortative dating, look what Jimsy and I were doing. We were doing something called code matching. Jimsy loved I love poetry. Jimsy loved French literature. I love French literature. Jimsy was about 5'5". I was about 5'8". Jimsy was slender and athletic. I was slender and athletic in my own peculiar way. Very peculiar way. So if we had kids, they would have had all the genes that were necessary to love French literature, to love poetry, to love being cerebral, to have big vocabularies. We would have been selectively mating for a whole mess of traits that we were comparing on that first thing that wasn't exactly a date, the first time we ran into each other in the dining room. So, and we would have been off on a lineage, off on the path of setting up a lineage that would have had its unique characteristics they could have offered to society in the same way that soldier ants do one unique thing for society. They're there for war, and they need to be there to protect the colony. And in the same way that the queens need to be there for an entirely different purpose for procreation. In the same way that basketball players need accountants and accountants need basketball players. We would have been doing our part to stretch out in a new direction on behalf of kind. Make any sense?
Yeah.
Aside from the fact that we would have been fucking like rabbits until we had our first fight, and then God knows what would have happened after that, because eventually what happened is that Jimsy went back to her headmaster, convinced him to leave his wife and son, and got him a job in Eugene, Oregon as a professor, and the two of them have presumably been living happily together ever since.
Presumably.
Even though Jimsy has presumably lost her tiny little hip-waist ratio. So I see these giant obese people, and I think, oh my God, poor baby. Not talking about you, TJ. You're not up to that level yet. We'll have to add another 400 pounds to you. But so you see these, hugely bloated people who are spherical, basically in shape, just like the bullfrog when he's puffing himself up. And it's believe me, in this case, it's not hot air. It's adipose tissue. And you think, oh my God, that poor baby is never going to find a woman who's interested in him. Well, 3 days later, without noticing it, you notice a 420-pound woman, and you think, oh my God, that poor baby is never going to find anybody who's interested in her either, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then, 10 days later, guess who you see walking down the street? The 625-pound man with the 525-pound woman. They have found each other. You may be tiny and scrawny, or in my case, I may be tiny and scrawny, and I may think that everybody wants, people who are basically tiny and scrawny in one way or another. But in fact, great big blimpo people like other great big blimpo people. People who are covered with green skin like warts and frogs and toads are attracted to other people who have green skin and look like they are the warts of toads. Not that I've seen too many of those in my neighborhood. Once upon a time, I saw two people in the tea lounge, each of whom had a strange kind of facial defiguration, each one of whom had one half of the face that just was not functioning and was warped in a weird way. And I saw them at different sides of the tea lounge, and I thought, wouldn't it be nice if these two people met? What didn't occur to me was the reason they were both there at the same time was they had walked in together. They were on a date. They walked out holding hands. What did they want in the way of another human being? Somebody had a weirdly scrunched up face like theirs. Now, once upon a time, Harry Harlow, who used to work with rhesus monkeys, did a little weird experiment. I don't know if you've ever seen this in a park, and I don't know, or in a zoo. I don't know if they're still popular, but when I was a tiny little kid, they used to have monkey islands. So you'd have this island with 300 rhesus monkeys on it. And Harry Harlow tried an experiment on one of these monkey islands. And he took one female and he lobectomized her. Now, don't ask me what a lobectomy is. All I know is that it involves inserting a scalpel into the brain and cutting your brains out. Cutting the monkey's brains out, actually, to be more specific. And they lobectomized one female and they lobectomized one male. Then they put these two back into the group with 298 other rhesus monkeys. And they had grad students following these rhesus monkeys every waking hour of the day and making elaborate notes. There was a problem. The grad students were supposed to follow, in particular, the two lobectomized monkeys and figure out what they were doing and how their lobectomy affected their social relations. But guess what happened? The grad students couldn't figure out the difference between the lobectomized rhesus monkeys and any of the other rhesus monkeys. The lobectomized male found his way to the lobectomized female as if he had some uncanny kind of radar. And the two of them copulated. Now, Frans de Waal, who comes from a later generation of monkey researchers, he monkeys around in Atlanta, and he used to do it at a zoo in Holland. Frans de Waal calls this the likeness principle. And so why do the two 645-pound people, oh God, TJ, one day I got on a plane. And God knows where I was coming from. It was only a year ago. I could have been flying in from Chicago or Las Vegas, any of the places where they have me come and give my ridiculous talks. So at any rate, I got onto the plane and I sat down next to this 650-pound person, and I was slightly disturbed because he took up enough space for three people, and there were only three spaces. But there was fortunately an empty space next to me, or so it seemed, until another 625-pound person, female, they were both over 6'2", walked in, and guess who she sat down with? Her boyfriend. And guess who was squashed? I mean, they should have put me in the little pocket where they put the safety information on the plane. I would have had more space there than I had in the seat. So, like creatures tend to stick together, and it's called assortative mating. It's like running a rake through things. It really is like sorting to find, okay, we'll put the little tiny peanut with the little tiny peanut and the big peanut with the big peanut and the peanut with tentacles and testicles with the other peanut with tentacles and hopefully a vagina. But at any rate, I mean, we were getting off the point here. Peanuts don't have vaginas. Somebody's going to call me on that one of these days. But the point is that...
Not today.
Well, when nature comes up with a peculiar variation, she seems to like to test that variation out by putting two people with a similar variation together and seeing just how far she can push the variation. And in societies that flourish from a specialization, from putting different tasks in the hands of different individuals, that seems to work out. I mean, for an example of a society that flourishes by putting different tasks in the hands of different individuals, take an ant colony. In an ant colony, there is most individuals are about half an inch in size, right? And God knows how wide, an eighth of an inch wide, a 16th of an inch wide, something like that. But there are these humongous creatures with great big jaws that are the size of 6 other ants or 8 other ants combined, and they are soldiers. They are specialized. There is another creature who is the size of your thumb, and she is the queen, and she is constantly laying eggs. Now, without this specialization of labor, the kind of thing that Adam Smith saw at work when he analyzed a pin factory back in the 1770s, without the specialization of labor, a large-scale society wouldn't work, and an ant society can be up to 20 million individuals. So it's a very large-scale society. Well, ants do all of this with just one set of genes, one genome. The soldier ant is a sister to the tiniest ant in the colony, even though she's 17 times the smallest ant size, and all of them are daughters of the queen, who is humongous by comparison with any of the rest of them. So a single gene has the ability, a single genome has the ability to produce quite a lot of different variables, quite a lot of different characteristics. But in human cases, we seem to accentuate the specialization of individuals by categorizing humans in types. Now, it isn't you and me who do that. We don't do that out of prejudice or something like that. We do that in the process of self-selection. We do that in the process of who we fall in love with. We do that in the process of who we bed, who we wed, who we fuck, and who we impregnate. Because we tend, if we have a weird characteristic, a horn from the middle of our forehead, we're very likely to find the one human in the bunch who also has a horn protruding from our forehead. You grow up in a family that eats really bland food. You're growing up in China. You grow up in a family that has really bland food. These wild and wacky barbarians from Europe go out and discover a whole new continent that you've never heard of and they've never heard of before it's called the Americas, North America and South America. And in Mesoamerica, in the middle of the Americas, there are these people who've been doing these fantastic genetic engineering experiments. And among other things, they have taken a grass that produces a grass seed. It's not anything to brag about. If you're a cow, you can eat it, but not if you're a human. And they've coaxed this grass seed into producing great, great, great big seeds, and it's called corn. Hey, a whole new breakthrough for humanity. And they've taken these tubers and they've coaxed them into producing these great big bulbous kind of tubery things that sit in the ground, and those are called potatoes. And they've done the same thing with some other poor plant that they've tortured into producing tomatoes, and they've done the same thing with another poor plant that they've convinced to produce jalapeno peppers and chili peppers and a wide variety of peppers that are really hot to the taste. Now, here you are in China, right? The Americas have just been discovered. Some of these wacky Westerners, even though they smell foul as could possibly be, you call them, these barbarians, you call them butter eaters and meat eaters because you can smell the odor that the meat and butter sets into them from a mile away. You have to hold your nose to get anywhere near them to affect the trade. But they come over with these things that the Mesoamericans have made called chili peppers. Okay, you come from a bland family, a family that eats a bland diet, and all your brothers and sisters eat bland things, and you're not getting much attention by being bland, so you decide to become a rebel. And what do, TJ?
No idea.
You figure out how to use those tomatoes and chili peppers to produce Hunan cuisine. Cuisine so hot that you can that you can start fires with it, right? Just breathe on your local pile of kindling after eating a hot Hunan meal, and whoomp, a bonfire, right? So there you've differentiated yourself by using a different diet, which is one way that humans differentiate themselves from each other. Now, what do you manage to find as a wife? Somebody who's really hot for Hunan cuisine and likes to rebel as much as you do. And when you have kids, the kids differentiate themselves by being likers of Hunan cuisine, and they basically raise a finger and say, screw you, to people who are eating bland cuisine. And all this sounds like just an airy fairy tale. It has nothing to do with anything in life. But the fact is, what you're setting up is a new subculture. You're setting up a new subculture that's so different that the people smell different. When a person who eats Hunan cuisine, the hot stuff, smells different than a person who's eating a bland cuisine. And eventually, the bland cuisine eaters can't stand the smell of the hot cuisine eaters, and vice versa. So these groups keep getting further and further apart. And as they get further and further apart, the Hunan cuisine people set up a whole different standard of beauty. They basically say, screw you to the standards of beauty that their brothers, sisters, and cousins who are still eating bland food go for. And they come up with their own rebellious standard of beauty. Now they are doing selective breeding of themselves because they're looking for women who live up to their standard of beauty, and their standard of beauty is utterly unique. It's like nothing you've ever seen before. So these groups get further and further apart genetically. They get further and further apart in the way they look. They get further and further apart in what they eat, and they get further and further apart in what they smell. And eventually, TJ, and this is for real, we are not talking fairy tales here, eventually they end up speaking such a very different variation on the language they all started with that they can scarcely understand each other anymore. And now what does this all accomplish for the grander scheme of society? Oh, I'm wiggling my laptop here. Um, I'm forgetting that we've got a camera in there. So, at any rate, what does it accomplish? Well, since each subculture is a different hypothesis about how to go about doing things, and these societies fling the finger in each other's face by coming up with concepts that are just different. The way that Sarah Palin followers cannot stand Barack Obama followers. And Barack Obama followers, if there are still any left, and it's hard to tell, but Barack Obama followers cannot follow Sarah Palin followers. And how long ago was it that Sarah Palin first made it on the scene? Three
Let's
years,
see.
3 years ago, TJ, maybe 2.5.
I think it was less, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, well, in 2.5 years or so, these subcultures have differentiated themselves radically on the basis of a simple little thing like a woman who knows how to wear lipstick and hot shoes. um, and they've differentiated themselves in everything. They like different diets. One is busy eating vegetarian diets, and the other is eating so much steak that the blood is dripping from their fangs every time they come away from the Weber grill. Um,
Oh.
and they differ about politics, and if the Sarah Palin people know the Barack Obama people love something, that means they have to hate it. It has to be part of some diabolical scheme to take over America for Marxist jihadists. When was the last time you met a Marxist jihadist, by the way? Okay,
Every other
that's
day.
what they believe. Yeah. So and meanwhile, all of the Barack Obama people have to do is get a whiff of the fact that the Sarah Palin people are interested in something, and whammo, it's the kiss of death, as far as they're concerned. So we have two different groups setting themselves apart with two different strategies about how to approach everything in life. What does that do for our society? It's like giving you a left hand versus a right hand. The left hand and right hand are two radically different things. I mean, the thumbs are in the opposite direction. Have you ever noticed a person whose thumbs both point to the left or both point to the right? No, thumbs are made so they point in the opposite direction. See, can you see that? Opposite direction. Not like that. Okay. Because opposites are necessary to allow a group to feel out different directions. And a group needs different options because it's in a constantly changing environment. Now, another way in which groups differ in their strategies. In Kenya and in certain areas of Africa, you have these migratory tribes like the Bantu. And the migratory tribes will herd a bunch of cows, and they have to be predictors of change, because a patch of grass will show up in one location during one part of the year, and then it will go totally dry, and the cows will have eaten everything that hasn't gone dry. And then they need to find another patch of grass, and that patch of grass, the new one, at that particular season is likely to be 1,200 miles away. So these are people who are really attuned to changes in meteorology and the changes in grass, when grass shows up. But there are other people who basically want to screw you to the cattle eaters. Oh my God, those goddamn cattle eaters, have you seen what they've been eating recently? Oh my God, and you see the way they treat their women? Oh, and their politics are, I mean, they should be exterminated from the face of the earth. And who are these people that feel that the cattle grazers should be eradicated from the face of the earth? Goat herders. Cattle herders live down in the valley because that's where the grass is. And goat herders tend to live higher up on the slopes because that's where the stuff goats can eat is. And never the twain shall meet. I mean, I don't know if you remember old episodes, because this is before you were born, of Taxi. And in Taxi, one of the actors played this guy who came from God knows what God-forsaken Balkan country. And the hill people absolutely hated the people in the valley. And the valley people absolutely hated the people of the hills. Well, what's the difference between the people of the valley and the hills? One has made an adaptation to the stuff that's in the valley, like grass, for example, stuff that cows eat. And the other has made an adaptation to the stuff in the hills that cows couldn't possibly touch, that goats eat. And they hate each other. And what's the value of them hating each other? I'm not that I'm advocating hate between groups, TJ. I am not. I think it's a bad idea. But what do we get out of them hating each other? Two radically different approaches to mining and environment. Two different ways or different strategies that allow one to mine one micro portion of the environment and another to mine a different portion of the micro environment. And what does this have to do with sex? Well, most of the people up in the hills are going to think that the people down in the valley are absolutely disgusting and want to mate with other people who know how to herd goats and share their beliefs and share their system of or share their values about things like beauty. And as a consequence are actually self-breeding themselves to have the genome that fits their standard of beauty. And the people down in the valley feel the same way. But of course, there are always outsiders. These are called diversity generators. in my second book, Global Brain. There are always the people on the outside who can't resist a tall, dark stranger. Well, guess where the tall, dark stranger comes from if you're a person living up in the mountains? It's
Probably
one of
from
those people you're not supposed to touch down in the valley.
yeah.
And guess who the
Forbidden
forbidden
fruit. Yeah.
yeah, the forbidden fruit is if you live down in the valley. A girl from up in the mountains. Oh God, I've always wanted one of those. Right?
Yeah.
Now, does this ever happen in real life, or is Bloom, as usual, talking out of his ear holes in his ass? Ever heard of a play called Romeo and Juliet?
No, I'm not familiar with that. Never heard of that.
Yeah, and it's a common theme. The guy falling in love with a person he's not supposed to fall in love with because she comes from another group that's breeding itself, deliberately self-breeding itself in a different direction. Okay, now is there really any evidence whatsoever that people self-breed to become physically different? Well, aside from the fact that some people on the planet are black and some people on the planet are white and some people on the planet are sort of a golden yellow color and that we have different eyebrow structures and different lip structures and a whole bunch of stuff like that, we won't take those as evidence at all. Let's try this. Back in the 1970s, I was the leading black publicist in the music industry. Now, take a careful look at my face. You can see very clearly from my skin tone why I was the leading black publicist in the music industry, right?
Yes, because you're
Okay.
obviously a black man, so.
I'm obviously a black man. Obviously a black man. Okay, so
Very
I started
light-skinned black man, but
very
still.
light-skinned black man with a very unusual nose for a black person. But at any rate, so there must have been some Jew in the family somewhere. But we won't talk about that.
Way
That's
back.
That's And as a consequence, I had to buy all of the black publications that normally white people don't read. And there was a black publication back in the 1970s called Chocolate Singles. And Chocolate Singles was one of those publications that was dedicated primarily to personal ads. Now, there were magazines like Screw in the white community that, and I kid you not, that was the title of the publication, that were dedicated to personal ads too. And publications like Screw that were white publications dedicated to personal ads had all ads for men. I mean, what woman would ever bother to advertise in Screw? Women had as many men as they could possibly want to screw. It was men who were desperate, right?
Mm-hmm.
So all the ads were from men. But in Chocolate Singles, it was the other way around. All the ads were from women. And here's the kicker. The very first line of every single personal ad, and I mean without exception, was must be over 6'1". Did I tell you the story in a previous tape?
Nope.
Okay, good.
And that's really bizarre, so I'm hoping to get an explanation there.
So imagine that you are one of these women advertising for a man who's over 6'1" in back in 1970. How old would your kids be now, TJ?
In their 20s or
They'd be in their 30s and 40s by now. Yeah. And now, what are these ones? Remember, there's this phrase, natural selection. And you know where Darwin came up with that phrase?
No.
He lived in the countryside at Dove Cottage, and he was surrounded by gentlemen farmers. And the obsession of gentlemen farmers, that is the aristocrats who owned the farms, not the guys who had to do the work, the obsession was breeding. They were obsessed with breeding in two different areas. They were obsessed with breeding in animals, and they were obsessed with breeding in their fellow human beings. So they were very careful about who they let their daughters marry, but more important, if they wanted to have the biggest pig in the county, and some of them did, and they wanted to win all of the agricultural fairs, and some of them did, by absolutely having the biggest, piggiest pig you've ever seen in your life, they would spend decades looking for the biggest male and the biggest female and the biggest crossbreed and the breed that put on the most weight and the breed that looked the orneriest but still behaved like a pig. Until they finally had the biggest brute in the county and could possibly at least contend for winner at the annual fair. And this is serious stuff. I mean, they became fixated with breeding horses. They became fixated with breeding dogs. Look at the gray wolf. Look what we humans have done with the gray wolf by selective breeding, carefully picking the mom, carefully picking the dad. We've taken the poor gray wolf that looks something like a German Shepherd with gray fur and turning him into everything from Great Danes to boxers. I mean, how do you convince a dog to have no face?
Yeah, sometimes I own 2 dogs, and one of them is a pug, and sometimes I'll just look at him and be like, wow,
how the hell
your
did you do that?
ancestors would be ashamed, man.
Right. So Darwin is watching this obsession at work in his local community, and all of a sudden it occurs to him, hey, if Malthus is right, and if we multiply or if our food base multiplies at an arithmetic rate, meaning it goes up like that, and if our population increases at a logarithmic rate or something like that, meaning it goes up like that, then this, have I got that right? Well, one is not going to keep up with the other, and eventually people are going to starve to death by the millions. And if people starve to death by the millions, that's selective breeding because only the ones who manage to grab enough food are going to survive. So you have to have the characteristics that allow you to grab food in order to survive. In other words, nature is doing what the pig farmer down the road is doing, looking for the best father and the best mother and the best combination of genes to make absolutely the monster pig of all times or the monster human. So what were these women doing who were advertising in chocolate signals? They were selective breeding as carefully as the breeders of Arabian horses, dogs, and pigs, the aristocrats of England who were obsessed with this stuff. Now, it's 30 to 40 years later, and things have changed a little bit in the black community. I'm going to make a grotesque overgeneralization here, but I'm making it from the fact that even you, TJ, at 6 foot, what are you now? 6'6"?
Yeah, 6'6".
Okay, there you are at 6'6". I know this happens to me on rare occasion. It probably happens to you. You're walking down the street, and six kids come walking towards you, especially if it's six black kids. And they part and they walk around you, and you feel like a midget. Because, well, you don't have this experience, TJ, but I have it. There I am at 5'7.5", and I've just been passed by a swirl of people, every single one of whom is over 6'5". I mean, these people could crush me and put me in their pockets if they wanted to. Where the hell did that come? That came from selective breeding in the black community back in the 1970s. Now, I went down to my local T-Mobile store to get myself a little Wi-Fi card, and the people there they were lovely to me. They were just terrific. But both of the employees were black, and it's over in a black neighborhood. And the girl who was helping me was 5 feet tall. And eventually it occurred to me that she probably had a boyfriend because she was cute as could be, and she was around 22 years old or something like that. And I asked her if she had a boyfriend, and she said she did. And I asked her if her boyfriend had a job because I was guessing her boyfriend would be 5'8". Why? Because there's this thing called sexual dimorphism. Women tend to be small and men tend to be big, and small women tend to like big men, even though there's that assortative mating thing where little people end up marrying little people and big people end up marrying big people. Still, I figured 5'8", that's relatively short these days. That would be her guy. And I asked if he had a job, and she said no. Oh my God. Okay, now this guy's not committing. This guy is not contributing anything to her life. He's not helping her get along. He's not helping her with income. He's not helping her pay the rent. Nothing. So that means the guy has to be 6'2". Because what is he contributing? Genes. He's contributing genes. So I said, your boyfriend's 6'2", right? And her jaw dropped. And she said, how did you know that? And well, I knew it in part because in addition to asking what her boyfriend did for a living and finding out that he had no job, she'd given an additional bit of information. When I asked what her boyfriend does do, she says he hangs out on street corners and brags about how many babies he has. Okay, the other girl in the store who was also black was about 5'8", about my height. And I asked her whether her boyfriend had a job. And she said no. And I said, well, then your boyfriend must be 6'6". And she said, how did you know? And 3 minutes later, her boyfriend walked into the store and made me look like a midget. So now what are we talking about here? We're talking about assortative mating, making choices so that people in one subculture will tend to pick one kind of guy and people in another subculture will tend to pick another kind of guy. So if you look at a basketball team, a professional basketball team, how many Jews do you see these days?
0. None. I think it's actually in the
0.
negatives.
0.9. Yes, I think it would be in the negatives too. Why? Because Jewish women also are selective breeders. But what did they select for?
I'm not extremely familiar with Jews in general, so.
Okay, well, you know me, TJ, so you can always tell people one of my best friends is Jewish. Um, so, at any rate, at least one of the people I interview all the time is Jewish. Okay, now, Jewish women go for doctors.
Right.
Jewish women go for intelligence. Jewish women go for smarts. So, how many accountants working for major basketball teams are Jewish?
Probably a lot more than are on the court at any given time.
Yes, I would think so. And that's the result of selective breeding. Now, does a basketball team need guys who are 6'10"?
Yeah.
Does it need accountants?
Um. Well, in a more abstract sense, yes, but yeah, not in the
Yes.
immediate.
Yeah. You can exchange accountants. You can change accountants more easily than you can change one superstar basketball player for another,
Yeah,
as Cleveland has
definitely.
just learned. Right. Okay. So the point is that without the accountants, the basketball players would not make a living. And without the basketball players, the accountants would not make a living. So we're talking about assortative mating as stuff that leads the genes in two different directions, just like it led to goat herders in one case and the people down in the valley who raised cows. And believe me, the people down in the valley who raise cows in Africa are 6'3", the Bantu.
Yeah.
They're distinctly physically different than the people who raise goats. Very physically different. I mean, me and my cousins, the Arabs, we're distinctly different. You can tell us apart. Our skins are a different tone. We're just, you won't mistake one of us for the other in most cases. And we're cousins, for God's sakes. We parted somewhere down the line, 3,000 years ago or something like that. So maybe even more recently. So at any rate, all of this sexual stuff, this business of, well, I'm getting a little mixed up here because short women tend to like shorter guys and tall women tend to like taller guys. But I've seen women at the tea lounge who are 4'8" leading around these guys who are 6'6". There's another thing that happens in sex, and it's the pattern you see in the development of a relationship. If, like me, you sit around the tea lounge all the time and you watch these things, and if you read a lot of Eibel Elbisfeld and all the guys who study this stuff in great detail, you see that in the beginning, the woman is paying absolute attention to the man, and her eyes are shining, and her pupils are dilated, and she has a big smile on her face. That's a come on, TJ. That doesn't last long in the relationship. Once she gets the guy, you find two different things happening. First, the next time you see this poor Schlemiel, about 3 to 4 months later, this little 4'8" woman is leading this 6'7" giant around as if she's got a ring in his nose. And he's just following her like a tame animal. And of course, you also see the stages in the relationship. You see the stages where they're excitedly talking to each other. That's courtship. Then you see the stage where the two of them are sitting there on the couch, both staring straight ahead, looking absolutely dismal. That's when they're having their first fight. And then you see the woman leading the guy around by the nose. And then I had a friend who came into the tea lounge tonight. This is a couple I've known since they were 18 years old. I love them to death. They're absolutely terrific. They now have their first 2-year-old, and they have another bun in the oven. And they came in tonight, and when I talked about how excited you get about your wife, I got a response from the guy that tended to indicate he wasn't terribly excited about his wife anymore, even though his wife is the prettiest thing on the planet when she's not swollen up like a blimp. Why would she be swollen up like a blimp? She's a slender little thing, but you'll never know it because they plan on having 8 kids, and she is going to be balloon-like in nature for at least the next 9 years. So, at any rate, so the little hip-waist ratio is gone. And did we talk about hip-waist ratios last time?
I think we might have briefly got into it, but no, not particularly.
Well, basically, there is this thing. It used to be called curves in the 1940s. Men were into curvy women. And back in the 19th century, in the days of Gone with the Wind and all that kind of stuff, women wore these whalebone corsets around their middle. And what did they try to do? They tried to demonstrate that they had this little teeny wasp waist. Teeny little tiny waist. And they wore skirts. And what do skirts tend to show? Oh, in addition to a waist, they've got hips. So the hips go out like that. Well, man, we can't do these demonstrations properly on the screen, TJ. We've got to do something about this. The hands are not working. But at any rate, so women have this little tiny waist. See that? Little tiny waist. There we go, little tiny waist. And they have these great big hips. Um, and that's the way women are supposed to be shaped. And it drives men crazy, TJ. It drives them crazy all over the world. Even in Africa, where men like their women to have a 40-inch waist, they like their women to have a 56-inch hip.
Small
So the
waist, big hips.
Yes, that's right. So the hip-waist ratio drives men crazy. Why? It is a sign of fertility. Remember we were talking last time about how much nature wastes? How she just loves to waste stuff. She throws away flowers and flower petals by literally the gazillions every single year as if they didn't matter, because once their purpose of advertising is done, they're gone. They're finished. I'm sorry, we don't need you anymore. That even though we've put everything we've got into you, even though we've sucked up enormous amounts of resources, water, sunlight, all kinds of minerals from the earth, you're gone. Your history. Litter is the way nature does things. Nature loves to litter. So one of the cases of conspicuous consumption, that is one of the cases where nature uses waste to show off, isn't showing off the hip-waist ratio. Can you really be pregnant and have a baby come to term if you've got a tiny little waist?
I have no idea.
Just ask my friend who was in the tea lounge tonight and has her second baby on its way and hasn't seen her waist in years. Nor is she likely to for a long, long time if they're going to have another 6 kids. A tiny little hip-waist ratio is what, now TJ, because this is not PG-rated, thank God, TV, we can say things like this. It is a fuck me signal. It literally is a fuck me signal. It is a signal that says, I am ripe. I am so ripe to be impregnated, it's ridiculous. And the more men fight over me, the more choices I have. And because I've got this tiny little waist, I'll get 1,000 men to fight over me. And I'll ignore them. I'll step over their dying bodies as they try to get near me. Until I finally pick the one that's good enough for me. Some other girl might have no choice whatsoever. She might have to take whatever poor schlump comes along. Not me, bozo. I got all the privileges in the world. So when you've got that tiny little hip-waist ratio, there are a couple of other signals, by the way, of fertility. And they include brightly red lips, brightly red cheeks. You notice with makeup what women try to do, they try to act as if they've got little fertility cues, fuck me cues, that they don't actually have. They redden their cheeks. They redden their lips. They try to deceive you. Another fertility symbol, because again, it's a symbol of waste. It's something that goes totally against nature, is high little breasts. I mean, what happens to a woman's breast when she's 60 years old? Is the natural tendency of breasts to have nipples that reach to the sky?
By the time she's 60, they're usually touching the ground, so...
So does that tell you anything about their natural trobism, where on their own, left to their own devices, they prefer to go?
Yeah.
Like to your knees? Not to the nearest, not to kissing the clouds? But men in many, many cultures talk about getting their hands on girls who have nipples that reach to the skies. Because it goes against gravity, which is nature's most fundamental law. It breaks the law of gravity, for God's sakes.
Yeah, but
nature
then they
uses
just
breaking
deflate.
her own laws to show off. Yes, they eventually do deflate. I mean, some women manage, about 1 in 100 women manage to keep that tiny little wasp waist figure after they have babies. But it is rare as rare can be. I mean, Mother Nature isn't kind, TJ. We talked about the fact that she's bloody in the teeth. We talked about the fact that she's a frigging bitch. I mean, she kills off everything on the planet. Think what it must be to have the ideal hip-waist ratio when you're 16 years old. And to be able to keep it till when you're 23 and then be without it for the rest of your life. Think of what it's like to have a face that's so gorgeous with little red cheeks and little red lips and big brown or blue eyes that every man in sight salivates at the mere sight of you, and as you can tell in his heart is willing to crawl across the ground and push pennies with his nose in order to get anywhere near you. Think of having that, from the age of 16 to the age of 23. And then think of making it through the next 50 years of your life without it.
Yeah,
It's got to be heartbreaking.
And you never stop mourning it, I'd imagine.
You never stop mourning it. And now, is God nice if he made us that way? Is nature nice if she made us that way? If she made us for 6 years of absolute delight and 50 years of pleasure? I mean, of remorse 50 years of misery, 50 years of torture and pain? Is that a kindly little Mother Nature who will always be green and take us to her bosom and treat us well as long as we daven to her, as long as we bow to her and scrape to her and make sacrifices to her and use less electricity and turn the thermostat down to 68 degrees and wear sweaters in the house during the winter and all of those things that will make nature kindly and nice again? Is that a nature who's going to be green and kindly and nice if we do what the radical evolution, the radical ecologists, the deep green ecologists of Scandinavia want, and eliminate everybody on the planet? Well, eliminate basically 6.2 billion people, so that the planet only has 100 million people on it, which is all nature they figure can handle. Is nature going to turn nice? Is all of a sudden she going to eliminate pain and death? Is she going to aging? No, she's not. People will still come out looking like piles of rutabagas the way my face looks. I mean, look at this face. God, what a fate to be stuck inside this thing. It looks like a pile of.
The Christians had. I mean, the Christians had to make up a reason why the world sucks so bad if God is so great. Like, yes, oh no, we fucked it up. That was us. We ate that fruit.
Yes, that's right. They called it they pulled out a sinus ex machina. Not a deus ex machina, an anti-deus ex machina, a Satan ex machina, a snake ex machina, a serpent saying, try this piece of fruit. Now look, is a God who's going to punish humanity for 100,000 generations over one piece of fruit or one bit of information? That's all knowledge is, right? One little bit of information. Is that a kindly, gentle, nice God?
I tend not to think so, but, you know.
No, I mean, there's this poem by Archibald MacLeish, and it says, if God is God, he is not good. And if God is good, he is not God. Now, let me run that past you one more time before we explain it. If God is God, he is not good. If God is good, he is not God. In other words, if God is all-powerful, then he's certainly not good, because look at all the crappy stuff. All the monstrous torture he's made. Look at all the mass murder he's created. On the other hand, if God is good, there's obviously, he's not almighty, because there's some force of evil around he has no control over, right?
Yeah.
So one way or the other, the whole concept of God is a little bit screwed up. But the point is, whether we regard it as God, evolution, or nature, nature is very cruel, and very cruel when it comes to sexuality, because only about 1 in 10 men at most get all the women that they would like, and even they don't get all the women they would like. I had a friend who was so drop-dead gorgeous it was ridiculous. And he's a doctor and is very, very high-placed in his field. Plus, he's a professional photographer for Italian fashion magazines. Plus, he's a dynamite musician and has written an entire opera, an entire rock opera about, oh God, what's his name? The Prince, Machiavelli, about Machiavelli. Amazing, right? Plus, he's tall and gorgeous. Well, he's so tall and gorgeous that he got tired of all the women he was able to get. Even the women he was able to get, some of those gorgeous women on the planet, began to bore him, poor baby. And he finally, in his mid-40s, went after a woman who was 25 years old that he thought was gorgeous because he needed to test the limits of his powers. In some forms of psychology, it's called reality testing. And it was only when he tested himself against this 25-year-old woman 20 years younger than he was and discovered that he couldn't get her, that he finally settled down and got married again.